Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. I don't know if we'll need the microphone or not. It's probably more for just kind of archival purposes. Thank you, Kevin, for that excellent introduction. I was hoping you wouldn't mention Summer Academy, not because it's not a great program. It was a great program, but just to think that...
I still have the work from that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm really actually concerned about. You know, I'm thrilled to be here speaking to you guys. I want to thank Delaney Bannister and Christine Johnson, Laura Vitotsky for helping with the exhibition. They did a marvelous job staying on top of details and mounting what was a challenging kind of installation in a kind of unexpected way. It looks beautiful down there. In addition to Haley Algo, I almost forgot, sorry about that, who also was assisting in that endeavor. I also want to thank the Lectures and Events Committee for their support. Of course, the Center for American Architecture and Design, Michael Benedict, and certainly, not least of which, Kevin Alter, whose continued support was critical for bringing the material here, but also whose commitment to studying the American legacy of home building was a really inspiring and kind of formative thing for those of us that had the good fortune to see his research on display here at the school in the 90s. And in a way, you know, some of this work is an extension of many of the things that we as students kind of discovered through those exhibitions. So we're deeply indebted to Kevin for making that happen. You know, before getting into the background behind the project in the gallery, I wanted to speak briefly about a running theme in my studio's work that is connected to the Mass Market Alternatives project in a fundamental way. And it's also like, you know, being back here at one's alma mater to lecture, you know, you have to kind of resist the temptation to go into a really serious ideological diatribe. I'm going to try and stick to the subject at hand, but I do think that a little bit of conceptual background would be important to understanding why the project operates and looks the way that it does. And looking back at our work, my studio's work from the 8 years prior to initiating this latest project, working in digital media and in architecture in parallel means that there's a perpetual call to play one off of the other. It's because the digital tools are now integral to the architectural design and construction process. They're not going anywhere, obviously. The problem with it, this perpetual call, is that it forces an ontological debate if you're not careful. The fluidity and the speed of digital technology can make being human seem debilitating on a certain level, and I believe that attempts to bring architecture and digital technology together to share an agenda that is, you know, trying to overtly transform one via the other, as it were, are about closing that gap. But I also can't say that I've seen or heard anything that makes me believe a project focused on reframing architectural concerns using a technology-oriented agenda does real justice either to architecture or the technology involved. So I think there's tremendous liability there. And in the case of digital technology, if our humanity is part of that liability, those pursuing digital architecture synthesis are going to get tripped up. Architecture is not legible outside of the lens of our own humanity, and in the meantime, it's probably best if digital technology be put to work for architectural values and become their humble steward, just as indoor plumbing did, and just the same way sustainable technologies are or should. But being exclusive about what architecture doesn't eliminate the obligation to supply a definition. I think any good practice should probably attempt to do so. Short of having one to share with you here today, I struggle with it myself. I find the following to be a provocative, if not useful, set of clues in that direction. This first one, design as being focused on perfecting our relationship with the material world. Design being pure premeditation can't really be characterized in any other way, I don't think. Design's a broad category that touches on many disciplines, and by conventional standards, it includes architecture, but buildings are a human preoccupation. And actually, I've got these out of order. That's so embarrassing. That should have been the second one. Perfection is an inhuman concept. I think while each of us strives for perfection, it's our idiosyncrasies that define us. True intimacy is knowledge and acceptance of someone else's imperfections, and nothing seems so human as when it appears vulnerable. And what was meant to be the last one, buildings are human preoccupation, essentially brings the two together in a way that I think causes me to see architecture in a significantly different light than I think the conventional definition would have us see it. It's a reflection of my belief that our buildings are similar to us with respect to this second tenet, and they are most potent when they endure the trials of occupation and elemental exposure, occasionally presenting an obstacle to the former, asserting their presence and disrupting expectations. So, knowing that, I was going to say a little bit about this asteroid, by the way. I'm not sure it completely fits at the moment. Maybe we'll talk about it later, but there's something, I don't know if you guys saw the story about this, but they believe that this might have actually been an alien probe cruising through the solar system earlier in January this year. A lot of speculation there, but just the idea that somehow our entire perspective on materiality might be reframed by another kind of a point of view that is fundamentally different in every respect has a kind of humbling effect on the way in which we try and see architecture as this kind of pinnacle of reason and creative activity, or reason and creative accomplishment. But this thing about buildings being imperfect and thus exhibiting a kind of radiance and richness as a result is something that is perpetually out of reach of a orthodox professional practice, mainly because it's very hard to convince a client that something imperfect is exactly what would do justice to their investment in said project. And I was going to talk a little bit about how some of the previous work was an attempt to capture that. But I think I'm going to skip directly into talking about the mass market project in the interest of time. We might come back and have a conversation about this perhaps in Q&A. We'll see. So, this is Houston. And this is a slice of Houston between Highway 99 and Beltway 8, where Highway 290 intersects with Farm Road 1960. You guys might know 290 because it's basically the conduit between Houston and Austin. Houston's a little bit like a tree, as it turns out. As it ages, it keeps building ring roads about its center. The mass transit situation, the highway system there, has made a kind of proliferation of suburbs possible. So it's one of the kind of prime areas to study how industrialization has evolved towards making suburban housing, the production of suburban housing, and the marketing and sales of suburban housing more efficient. Mass Market Alternatives is a project about the contemporary American suburb, and in this case specifically Houston suburbs. It probes the relationship between aesthetics and community building, or it's meant to. America sets many of the global standards for popular culture. This is perhaps a privilege of having the largest and most stable economy, at least for the time being. And although there are times when I wonder if the American pop cultural hegemony and its economic hegemony are rooted in some deeper principle, that is, if they are sibling phenomena supported by something ingrained in American thinking. For example, democracy could be characterized in part by the freedom to indulge, and also the rejection of a definitive cultural standard. We have laws here in America, of course, but once you get past the level of basic human morality, such as issues of life safety and protection of property, pursuit of happiness, etc., and into cultural territory, all bets are off here in America. And absent the kind of heritage that usually provides a political body with cultural guardrails, we're just too young of a country to have that, our economic system, capitalism, is the default means for shaping the cultural arc of American society, for better or worse. The suburbs is one manifestation of this dynamic. The American dream of living as a nuclear family in a state of pristine natural beauty was so captivating that it became a relentless landscape of sameness, bringing both disdain and accolades, as it turns out. Consumer behavior has a big say in America's cultural arc because in America, economic success brings real authority. And the suburban real estate market, with its obsession with middle-class respectability, is keenly aware of this, despite how poorly it seems to be managing its own success from the point of view of those of us who compose space and form for a living. But that's the real question here. As disappointing as all this may seem, it does beg the larger issue, or questions. Does architecture matter in a highly industrialized capitalist economy? What are its priorities? And how do they define what constitutes a meaningful experience? The Mass Market Alternatives Project pursues answers to these questions in its attempts to leverage the influence of aesthetics in setting cultural precedents and explore what the suburbs means and how it contributes to the ever-evolving American cultural profile. All right, so this presentation is effectively in two parts. The first is sketching out the critical perspective that served much of the inspiration for the project, and the second is going to be a quick outline of a strategy for implementation that packages the work in a more market-friendly portrait. Side A. Just to kind of start with the basics, everyone in here is probably familiar with what a subdivision is, but make sure we're all on the same page. There might be, some of you from out of town may be a little unfamiliar with the American suburbs. This is a subdivision. As seen from the outside, standing on one of the several feeder roads that circumscribe it, which is a common pattern in Houston. Subdivision is a common term used to describe a large swath of detached homes built virtually simultaneously and marketed as a planned community. The moniker itself comes from the legal process by which the tract of land on which the development sits is divvied for individual sales. In a nutshell, the subdivision is important because it is the building block of the American suburb. Now, in making a subdivision in Houston, Texas, Houston being relatively flat, the first step is this kind of scorched earth technique where the tract of land is cleared entirely of all significant vegetation, in this case, all vegetation. The kind of brutality of this act is ultimately, ultimately masked by the great lengths developers go to landscape after construction is finished. So, heavy landscaping is just part of the budget of building a suburbs in Houston. It turns out a subdivision in Houston. It turns out it's just cheaper to go ahead and pull everything out and start fresh and then go and put it all back, as opposed to work around it. So there are these kind of astonishing kind of huge scars that come and go in Houston. The homes in a suburb, or in a subdivision, are often referred to as tract homes. As a result of the fact that they are all built on a single tract of land. They're made from an ingenious system of components that can take any shape. The homes, as a result, the homes are a weird combination of details and specifications, some practical, like sloping roofs and water-shedding eaves, some more decorative. And I like this photo because it's the anonymity of the plywood-clad lumber framing shell in this image that reflects the level of artifice at work in manufacturing the quaint domestic portrait that is eventually to come. And in the typical tract home, like in most industrial commercial buildings, many components are precariously dependent on fringe practices in material science. So, the layers of construction that will connect the decorative finishes that are eventually going to be applied to this house here with the substrate just below the products you're seeing. That intermediary application of materials is composed of highly artificial products with mysterious origins, often so foreign that they have to be branded to hell and gone in order to be identified in construction. It's almost as if the next step is going to be printing instructions on these materials so that just about anybody could do it, perhaps. Now, with a little bit of icing and trim, the typical finished tract home becomes ultimately a kind of nostalgic pastiche of vernacular flourishes like the ones you see here. They're kind of perpetually remixed for variety's sake from house to house. And applied to as a way of dealing with floor plans that are arranged in a dance unto themselves that balance the cost of construction with the market's demand for unique curb appeal. And forgive the bleak images in this case. This is Houston in the depths of winter. So, yeah. In this dance that takes place in the floor plan, architectural principles of balance and composition are more a liability than anything else. Facades and roofs have to conveniently accommodate any spatial arrangement as the plan flexes to allow fashionable trends and home amenities to appear and disappear as needed. So long as the recombination isn't repeated on the same block, the system of the flexible details and the floor plan's standardization delivers on its promise of feeling special from one home to the next. But that only really applies to the front of the house. The market doesn't demand the developer think holistically about the home's exterior. Buyers don't seem to be terribly concerned. It's likely the combination of amenities-based planning and cost-cutting measures work together to produce these interesting results on the remaining non-public sides. Sometimes I just don't know what to say. These areas of the homes, they dispense with pretense, paying kind of tepid lip service to the design, or to design, with their arbitrary material embellishments that save them from appearing entirely discontinuous with the front of the house. The windows are small, idiosyncratically placed in most cases, and likely for privacy, being that the neighboring home will be built nearby on the next door lot there. And in some cases, the windows are only present because code dictates it. This one's not terrible, but The funny thing is, while these presentations are on the sides here are lacking for lots of reasons, they are nonetheless kind of provocative. They're a little bit like serialist music, where tonal consonance takes a back seat to experimenting with unusual intervals, perhaps. That's the typical suburban subdivision, full of homes like this. It's kind of an unwitting experiment in serial composition that inadvertently reveals the true architectural essence of industrialized housing, perhaps. And I'm trying to wax poetic on something that actually I do think has some merit from a compositional point of view. Now, there's something quite daring about this, despite its obvious shortcomings. And I think that there's an important lesson embedded within it. Now, in reaction to the oddity of these facades and the systematic nature of the home's manufacture, it occurred to us back at the studio that one might establish some architectural level of integrity within the existing formula for tract home production by seeing the home strictly from a permutational point of view. It might require us to depart from the current design vocabulary, but it's clear from the builder's process that the look of the homes is not fundamentally tethered to the intelligence of the system. And if the suburban houses took a sudden turn from the nostalgic pastiche that we're all familiar with, the notion that a home reflects the values of its owner might make such a project that departs from this pastiche a vehicle for diversifying America's suburban communities, which do have a persistent diversity problem. So, what we did is tried to develop a stochastic method for planning a home that could provide a baseline variety that would meet market demands as we understand them, but also push our definition for domesticity in new directions and essentially expect more of its occupants, setting a new cultural standard precedent by providing a means for living differently. So this is a quick video just showing a script that we were using to pattern out the base for the house. This is actually an interesting moment right here. Oh, I blew it. Let's see here. Let's try it again. Sorry about that. Let me see if I can find out with a pause here. I wanted to pause that real quick. Well, golly. I'll tell you what. Let's just let it run. When it comes up again, I'll try and be quick about it. But what essentially this little video does captures the process in a nutshell. It's essentially the beginning of the home designs themselves. And so the idea here is that the computer is given kind of license through a, tweaking some parameters and then using the random functions within the computer. And we're going to go ahead and just call them random. I know that there's, there could be a debate about that in and of itself, but let's just, grant me that license for right now. This is the spot here where the script takes a moment there. You see how the pattern is quickly kind of reinterpreted as something that might become structure, which is the nascent kind of proposition for taking the script to the nth degree and saying, okay, well, can we go all the way from conception of the home to final details with the press of a single button? That's a little bit outside of our programming experience. We'll probably have to bring in some computer scientists to do that. Don't exactly have the funding for it, unfortunately. But oh, geez, I didn't realize the sound would be on for that. I'm just going to mute that. Once those patterns are established, it still takes human intelligence, at least in our case, to bring the pattern to become a legitimate proposition for a home. So this is just a quick time lapse of the process of taking one of those patterns and applying a standard set of details that corresponds to the colors and the patterns you saw a moment ago. So each color represents a specific approach to detailing the exterior and interior of the home. The computer allows them to just kind of be randomly juxtaposed, and then it's the designer's kind of obligation to work out what that means to have one set of details essentially collide with another set of details. This is where the principles that I was talking about earlier come into sharp focus as far as this project is concerned. The idea that somehow the house might have an inherent kind of character that isn't necessarily entirely attuned to the notion of being perfectly coordinated. That the house may have some presence in that respect, and that presence might stimulate the occupants in a way that changes their definition of domesticity. So this is more kind of a beauty shot here of the patterns that we adopted for the project. In this case, we shuffled them into 4 flavors. In each case, the algorithm was changed slightly to reflect a kind of differing number of details in each body of work, but each collection of different colors here represents a different set of details. So in a sense, we have the 4 lines of homes kind of represented by these diagrammatic little studies. And then they would pair up with a series of details that are developed, essentially kind of isolated from the kind of overall picture of what the house might look like. And then these 2 pieces of information are allowed to just kind of come together on the drafting board as the pattern then kind of engages the work that's been kind of sorted out here at this stage. And the result is a kind of menagerie of domestic weirdness. In some cases, we've got things that might be a practical, like a 2 or 3 bedroom home. In some cases, we have something that's probably a little less practical. But what was really interesting about the process is that it generated both serious kind of orthodox propositions, but also these kinds of weird mutants that we felt were worth going ahead and pursuing just for posterity's sake, and adding the kind of like some integrity to the overall process, suggesting that, that somehow maybe we might learn something about homes if we were to actually get a chance to build some of them and, well, I don't want to say subject somebody to living in them, but I guess that's what it amounts to in a certain sense. So this is just a kind of a smattering of some of the floor plans that are downstairs. Or maybe it's all of them, actually. I don't. Yeah, it might be all of them. Sorry about that. Okay. So, going from that collection of mutants, there is a side B to this where the project would maintain some of its weirdness, but also maybe perhaps become a bit normalized in order to legitimately engage the market that it was essentially inspired by. The proposition that building subdivisions that are different in appearance might make the American suburbs more diverse is the segue to this other half of the presentation. The project is a serious speculative real estate proposal that is intended to address an underserved audience in the suburban real estate market. And those are potential buyers who are interested in the combination of metropolitan convenience and rural charm, which is embodied by the suburbs, of course, but don't subscribe to the saccharine nostalgia that has saturated the current supply. It could be this is simply a matter of supply and demand. And I'm willing to admit this might be an oversimplification of how the suburban real estate market works, but you got to start somewhere. Could be, this thing about supply and demand, out of the obligation to maintain growth in their businesses, the practice of building larger and larger subdivisions has trapped the current developers in a feedback loop that has narrowed the market's focus to the largest audience demographic. And I'd say that's probably one of the main reasons why we see so many homes looking the way that they do. That deviation from the formula on one part kind of might risk one's investment in the market. But as a developer's business grows, they want to guarantee that they can move product. And so there's a weird kind of like call and response there that turns into an echo chamber of sorts. The popularity of the vernacular pastiche makes it the perfect vehicle for dealing in larger volumes, and from that follows larger profits, of course. Now, decades of this behavior have led to suburbia's reputation as an environment of repressive conformity, where developers struggle to distinguish their product in the marketplace. Here it's the same collection of homes, similar to the ones we saw earlier. Deviating from the aesthetic formula risks their ability to move large volumes of homes and becoming over-leveraged. So therefore, they pivot towards marketing schemes that rely on an ever-increasingly novel means for distinguishing subcategories within the primary demographic. So here is a list of subdivision names just in Northwest Houston. The difference between Copper Village and Copper Lakes kind of escapes me a little bit, but I'm sure if you've been looking at these homes for long enough, if you're in the market, you probably appreciate the difference between the two. On the one hand, all of this kind of manifests itself as the absurd attempt to qualify different kinds of rural nostalgia by way of subtle language and connotative cues, creating interesting chimeras of populist emotional appeal. For example, Hidden Meadow, natural tranquility provided on an exclusive basis, perhaps. Carpenter's Landing, the earnest appeal of tradesmanship and industry seasoned with quasi-religious overtones, because as we know, Jesus is the most famous carpenter. Right? Middlestadt Estates, upper-class elegance, enhanced by a touch of foreign exoticism, via the spelling, of course. Now, these seem harmless enough, but on the other hand, some developments are taking things to the extreme and being encoded with appeals to other forms of social affiliation. Communities infused with a theme park-like quality in which infrastructural elements are arranged to dazzle and delight as well as make overt claims to social order. This is a subdivision in Northwest Houston, the name of which I do not have in front of me. But most subdivisions come with this amazing kind of manufactured lake, which is essentially a retention pond for storm runoff. But at some point, a developer said, hey, I could put a boat on that. And so it's become a central feature in a lot of suburban developments in Houston. Obviously, we can make the lake take any shape we want. These appeals to the market suggest the existing formula is close to being exhausted, being emphasis is shifting from the quality of the homes to the packaging in which they are delivered. And confusing the means for the end is always a bad sign for business in the long term, I'd say. Something new that remains focused on product might be a financial success simply by virtue of standing out while also appealing to those that have stopped seeing suburbia as an option for living due to the lack of variety that's present there. So based on that, we have a pitch video that's forming the basis of conversations with people who might be interested in investing in a project like this. Not to suggest this is the right audience for that, but I thought you might enjoy seeing it just because the homes themselves and the design is kind of showcased in a more detailed fashion. So. Oh, I got to unmute. Sorry about that. So by adopting the intelligence of mass production, but on a more limited scale, and developing a new set of standardized details to be distributed across a series of 30 designs, deployed in a neighborhood of maybe about 150 to 200 new homes, the goal is to produce something competitive to the status quo as far as financials are concerned, but offer a completely different spatial, organizational, and aesthetic paradigm in hopes of bringing those who have been marginalized by the existing formula back to the table. The approach is one of incremental change. Much of the community planning and land use strategy would remain the same, being tied to qualities that transcend the problems of aesthetic monotony. So we're talking about 1/2 to 1 acre lots, detached garages for detached garages for cars, or garage band rehearsals is what I meant to say. Dedicated secondary drives and streets with pedestrian and bike-friendly tertiaries that establish a sense of sheltered community, which is still necessary in the age of personal transportation and the habit of commuting to work. So, this is the ranch series. No, I'm sorry. This is the patio series, excuse me. These are the loft series. This is a 2-story model. What goes on behind the second floor facade is none of our business. And this is the ranch series. A kind of overt homage to that wonderful development down on the West Coast. And just as sophisticated too, by the way, guys. Yeah, of course. And then, of course, some quick detail renderings of the interior to finish it. One of the things we thought was really important to the overall package here is to showcase the interiors of the homes, which, there's a kind of a running question as to whether or not, or a running question as to why this kind of display was not part of advertising home plans and tract homes leading up to and through the 1980s. But if you look at the trend for suburban development in the 1980s, like the typical tract home was probably around 1,500 to 2,000 square feet, whereas nowadays the homes come in much larger scales, 3,500 upwards of 6,000 square feet. And I think the reason why we just saw the exteriors of the homes prior to that enlargement was because there just wasn't really much to show as far as the kind of like marketing kind of perspective is concerned. Once the houses reached a certain kind of critical size, it's possible to do something a little more dramatic on the interior. But I think that in and of itself is indicative of a kind of poverty that needs to be corrected within the approach to designing suburban homes. And many of these images are on display downstairs in the gallery, so I'm just going to kind of flip through them right now. And this one has a little bit of Hollywood showmanship to it. Thanks. Hi.
We've got a little bit of time to ask some questions if you want to.
Yeah, I'm way more comfortable with that format than the lecture one, I'll tell you that. Yes.
I love this project. I think it's super interesting. I love the tackling using the suburban model and the way you're drilling down on the specifics.
Thanks.
I'm so curious about if you've analyzed like the hardcore kind of like economics, like the stick frame, stick framing. Like I see the construction system that you're using is like steel concrete slab, but like what seems to be driving the suburban market is the economy of the stick frame system, the availability of labor, and then as soon as you switch systems, the economics just kind of get blown apart. I just wondered, could you comment on that at all?
I'll comment insofar as you're absolutely right about that. it's going to be a huge challenge. As far as we can tell, the first step is to do this on a speculative basis, or do this speculatively on a limited basis. So the homes would probably be marketed as premium, maybe a bit larger than the ultimate goal of working within a kind of modest suburban scale, which I would say is closer to the formula that we saw in the 80s, and not so much the kind of mega house that we're seeing nowadays. And in the process of building those speculative homes, we would refine the details to the point where we get a construction team and a real estate marketing team that understands the relationships of getting the necessary parties together so that the same kind of economy is reached. It's been a long haul. This is the initial stages of the project. If it makes it to the next stage, the next one will be the kind of R&D necessary to somehow capture some of the same kind of efficiency. And I think that's going to come in the form of things like SIPs. Precast. I'm kind of bullish on the precast question, partially because I think the economy might be there, but also because I think it's such a dramatic departure from where we are now that I'm just kind of excited about the idea that we might have like a neighborhood of tough boxes, But
is a ranch be stick framed? I mean,
it could be. It's not necessary that the construction be radically different. But I do feel like there's a lot of potential in essentially demonstrating that the stick frame is not the only option, but it's going to take a lot of refinement and research to get there. So, and maybe there's a good reason it's not already present. I think it's more market driven than anything else, and so that'll be something that, that whether or not that hypothesis pans out remains to be seen. Yes.
Why the courtyard typology?
Oh.
If that wasn't addressed, then you could have picked any.
Courtyard houses are great. Which I actually truly believe that's an honest answer. Yeah. But that's also the reason why everything down in the gallery right now is considered an A model. The pattern making script we have right now was trained to do the courtyard model. If there are other models, in the future, we'd probably change the letter to say, okay, this is a different kind of fundamental spatial paradigm, and hopes that this is a kind of stunt that we might be able to pull on a kind of ongoing permutative basis. So.
Does it seem like you could do an alphabet city type thing as well?
An alphabet city.
Or like it could be a series of, if you chose the O this time, you could have a C, you could have a T, you could have an L.
I like that. We should talk. Yes.
This is beautiful. I can't stop thinking about idler homes.
Well,
And the question is, how do you learn from that lesson of a really ambitious developer who works with the best architects in California and slowly realized that they couldn't use steel, it was too expensive, so the homes became basically a more evolved version of a stick frame construction, right? And at some point they failed because the margin of competition with the other merchant builders was such that they just couldn't keep up. Yeah. We all want an idler home now, but do you think Texas is ready for an idler?
Oh, well, absolutely. Of course I do. I wouldn't have gone through such great trouble if I didn't, but I'm sure there are people who would disagree with me, of course. I think, one of the things that's really interesting about the Eichler dynamic is this last point that you ended on, that the homes now are extremely desirable. And I think one of the big problems with the suburban real estate market right now is that the promise of those homes, the homes that we have that we're working with right now, making good on the expectation that there'll be a solid long-term investment is a bit shaky. Because the product, new product is being dumped on the market kind of on a perpetual basis. So if the demand is perpetually being sated by new product, how does the older product kind of maintain its value the way in which we expect a real estate market to work? Part of that is through location. But I also believe that, and this might be the kind of naive designer in me, but that things like, I think that as visionary as the Eichler home have a kind of a longer arc on which they could bear fruit. And we have those examples now to draw on when we talk to people about trying it again. And of course, I remain optimistic that the material science and manufacturing and globalization all might play a more important role in making it possible to use those kinds of materials in this scenario, which I don't think those dynamics are really in play at the time. So it's true. It's the project would be vulnerable in that respect, but we just don't know. And I think that conversations with professionals in the construction field as we go forward is going to help clarify that. Right here, yeah. Yeah, you,
Okay.
the one that doesn't know that I'm talking to you. Yeah, okay, right.
Could you talk a little bit about the necessity of it being a digitally driven process?
Convenience. I think one of the things that's kind of, let me see if I can clarify this quickly. That's the same dynamic exists to kind of just invent new homes out of the same kind of batch of details and prescriptions for amenities exists within the market right now, but it's like it's crafted on a kind of case-by-case basis. And a human mind is at work in those on that running project. Well, ouch. Professor Bennick said not really. We like to think they are, though. My belief is that process might be invigorated by something stupid in the mix, like genuinely stupid, such that it might force us into a moment where we have to kind of study a floor plan and think, well, that could work. Like something, I wouldn't have drawn that. Would you? I don't know. We have a lot of biases built up in us as a result of being kind of like, struggling professionals. I mean, everyone wants to do the right thing, and our clients' kind of agendas are forefront of our mind when we draw something. And that kind of like perpetual self-criticism as we work, I think is a liability when you see architecture as an opportunity to engage in these kinds of like scenarios of the unknown, where the building might not be the perfect fit for a particular program, but our understanding of that program is enlarged as a result of that juxtaposition. So, the computer is this kind of like blind in the system that produces things that we just have to engage, we're obligated to, and this is, this is my version of Professor Alter's looking for trouble, where this idea that the practical agenda within an architectural project ultimately kind of collides with something a little bit more exciting and probably digressive, but interesting nonetheless, and the possibility for the building becoming richer as a result of emerging from that intersection, embracing both sides of the equation, is a really provocative and interesting question. Probably something that I picked up as a student here. So.
Can you go over why you specifically chose Houston, and how do you think this typology is responding to the climate, and how efficient you estimate it would be?
Okay, let me go ahead and say that a firm kind of environmental control study has not been done on any of this work, and it's certainly in its future because that's incredibly important. I don't see it as something that drives the project in an overt way for reasons I tried to articulate at the beginning of my talk. But one of the ways in which you solve climatic problems in Houston's climate, whenever you want a lot of glass, is you just tint the hell out of the glass, and that has its own kinds of liabilities associated with it. Throughout and I'm just giving you one example, like through the course of the project, if we have to resort to something like that in order to maintain a bead on how the details that we have envisioned kind of fit the patterns that we're getting from the computer, then we have to embrace it. I think a generations of homes that have like heavily tinted but extremely generous windows in them might be a kind of statement in and of themselves. Maybe, something a little more fashionable than parachute pants, but definitely indicative of a specific time, and it could be that over the longer arc, if the homes kind of don't get demolished, people look back on that as a distinctive moment within architectural and technical history, perhaps. I don't know. So I'm comfortable with the idea that something like that, something specific like that, might be deployed in order to solve those problems. But I could not list those things for you, and it's definitely something we have to get serious about in the very near future. Oh, Professor Hain, yeah. Please.
I love the budget too, and I think the practical thing, when you open design a company, you were just talking to Alex about, most of the kind of developer crews, they don't even have a steel guy on site.
Yeah.
They can't afford steel labor, right? They're one steel guy that comes out and puts the header up to the garage door, and that's it, right? And I like about the project, but it struck me that it's actually quite nostalgic too, and I wonder if you talk a little bit about nostalgia, because there's a degree of nostalgia in what you're proposing as well, right? In the imagery that's driving you. And I'd like you could talk about that, because I actually like that part about it a lot.
Thanks. I'm comfortable with the idea there might be some nostalgia in the project. I'm not comfortable with the idea of making it the focus of the project, but like at some point we had to form some kind of like guiding principles for how the design or the details themselves were developed, and finding paradigms for those details. I suppose we could have just invented them, but I don't think it would have been as productive to do so. I don't think we would have gotten what variety we were able to eke out of the system we created for ourselves. That wouldn't have been possible if we would have just fell back on our own imagination to make those things happen. And it might become a useful marketing angle perhaps in the future, who knows. But each of the sets of details are patterned off of a body of work that I think is important for, I guess, obvious reasons. I mean, the precast line has there's an homage to the Chinati compound in there somewhere. The patio line is basically a Trinity University ripoff in the O'Neill Ford legacy. I mentioned the ranch line, although it may not be as dramatic in terms of its shaping and the sensitivity in terms of its massing, its relation to context. That's because the context itself, one of the big lessons from site design, if I remember correctly, is some sites beg to be dominated and some sites insist on dominating the building. And I'd say that Sea Ranch is a place where the building was dominated by the site, but in Houston, in the suburbs, those sites beg to be dominated. So the house ultimately takes a different point of view as far as its massing strategy is concerned. But the details, I think, are similar. And the texture of the building hopefully would be similar. And then the loft line, I think, is maybe the only anomaly there. That comes a little bit more from my experience in living in New York City and knowing that like an apartment with a toilet in the corner of an enormous room is kind of an interesting proposition in and of itself. Is there a less provocative mode there that still captures the kind of romance of like large open spaces that can be interpreted freely at will on a day-to-day basis? So.
I like that line too. I just have one more question though. Like, to follow that, John, like why, I mean, to me, the kind of thing that was most shocking was that the lots were so big, right? Like, because that's the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Like you've got, you're going on reasons. I think this had to do with the courthouse question.
Yeah, you make a good point. Yeah.
Why would they duplexes, or why is there kind of potential in the future where you go, I only need half of a yard. I only need that half of, I mean, if you're going to be like part of the center, I only need the yard of the street, the courtyard serves to internalize the house as opposed to, I'm so wondering where the project's going in your mind.
Okay, a couple of questions kind of embedded in there. I'll give you an answer to one, hopes that it answers the other. Because the thing about where it's going in the future is harder to answer, but I can give you a little bit of a play-by-play in terms of how the approach to the yard and the context works. The size of the lots is really a function of trying to eliminate a couple of things that are kind of endemic in the suburbs that I think are stifling a typical subdivision to mature into a real community of where a level of interaction is present that is commensurate to maybe a more dense area, which it would be an experiment. And what I mean by that is like in the suburbs, drapes are perpetually drawn. Exposure to the inside of the house is kind of a no-no. And I think that's a little bit has to do with the fact that the house's proximities like drive that. And if there was a little bit more space given, it's possible that when drapes may remain drawn throughout the day in hopes that the inside of the building would be a little more comfortable kind of spilling into the outside, just on a visual basis. Here's one place where the courtyard scheme makes sense. Practically, it's like it might be the substitute for the cedar fence that typically accompanies any suburban development. If you have your own sequestered piece of outdoor space in the center of your home, you'd probably be less inclined to build that cedar fence. And so as a result, these long green kind of zones might be a place where children can play kind of freely and essentially build their own kinds of communities as a result of having free access to these larger areas, perhaps. Because I think the cedar fence thing is a kind of an impediment to community building, as well as the kind of the perpetual kind of impetus to close one's windows. And for me, like site size, I think can contribute to solving that problem. So. Yeah, maybe we can continue to talk about this. Do you,
I love it.
Yes.
So happy to have you.
well, that means a lot. Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Nice. Is there another hand over here? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the kind of following up on that, like you kind of mentioned that the master planning is kind of falling into similar typologies.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak more why, like did you write a code that kind of places the house in relationship to each other in that like, context of the agency dictates it, or why it's more following that kind of traditional master plan?
I don't think you can call it a suburban development if it doesn't. Because, the definition for suburban is tied to, a certain level of density. And you start to play with that density. You start to question whether or not you have a suburban development on your hands. And the reason it's important to stay within the conventional definition of suburban is because, the suburban living has a specific appeal that can be disassociated with the nostalgia of the kind of the vernacular pastiche that occupies much of the marketplace. This is something that is driven by some of the murmurings within the marketing community that, like, for example, the millennial generation, which is maturing into home buying age, their interest in living in a micro apartment in a cosmopolitan city is kind of diminishing, and they're turning their attention to the suburbs because of the generosity of that model of development. So, this formula is meant to work within that particular aspect of how the overall kind of real estate market works in America. And tinkering with it, essentially, you have a completely different kind of proposition on your hands. So I think it's important to stick with the formula for that reason. Yeah.
So I want to direct you back to Trent's question about the necessity of the digital, but in a different way. And maybe just from a proposition, knowing a little bit about your history, like remembering you living in
a little bit about my history.
Yeah,
right.
Well, remembering you living in a difficult loft situation in Brooklyn,
Right.
Thinking about the Soho building that engaged kind of graffiti as a way to kind of make the character of the building something you couldn't predict as an architect. It seems to me one of the things that's so interesting about the digital and the project is creating an environment that doesn't just answer to the program, like the necessity for an ensuite bathroom and a master, or something, that you're generating things that are like your loft, that are difficult to live in a way that not just for difficulty's sake, but to make the building resist so easily being occupied. Is that just like, I wonder if that's something like you actually are interested in, or is just because it seems like the digital gives you that.
It's funny. I see the connection. I can't honestly say that was at the forefront of my mind whenever we set the parameters for the project. And it's true that, like, loft living is one of those places where the kind of dialogue you're describing is ever present. Whether for me though, the question of this particular dynamic's presence within the project is more contingent upon the quality of the space and less the kind of logic behind the distribution of the spaces therein. I think that the identity of the loft gets lost once you start talking about the presence of partitions, the sizes of the rooms, or the kind of openness associated with it. But this is something I guess I need to maybe some more therapy to sort out. In a way, there's something kind of very personal about that question. I find a little difficult. I grapple with it a bit. I would like to think that somehow I'm not a prisoner of those experiences, but it could be that is exactly the case.
I think one of the things that's so powerful about those kinds of conditions is that the building wasn't designed around a sort of preset idea of what an ideal bedroom is.
True. Yeah.
And that one occupies it in a conversation with the building. That it doesn't just bow down to some preordained idea about how a social life. And I think.
But I think, can I just end
Yeah.
that? It's like when we break with conventions, I think the typical motivation for an architect to break with conventions is to be more visible, to get some fame or whatever, to find a new pattern for things. But when you hand to the computer the ability to compose spaces, it seems like you, first of all, you use an evolutionary process. which is limitless variation, which is then selected for in some way. But the possibility comes up to create a building that in some sense resists you.
Yeah.
And the fact that a building sort of is not just a repeated dream, but it is wrong in some way, or is other, it really sets up the possibility for a relationship to it. Slightly vexed, but maybe more delighted than vexed.
True, yeah.
But that sense of like otherness or resistance, which happens when you reuse old buildings, find yourself in a loft, or in some other architect's work, like the fact that it's talking back to you, and it seems to me to be an important relational quality of the work. I just think that your work proceeds on such a very, very complex levels. It's hard to know for me exactly where to enter. I do wonder, like, does the magazine like dwell? Have they shown any interest in this? This is the ultimate millennial.
Well, yeah, we have some members of that generation, I think, are present, probably like to answer that question. But well, first of all, honestly, thank you for answering Kevin's question a minute ago. I appreciate that. That was a much better answer than I gave. It's funny, the project has found its way into a couple of media venues, and that's lent it some credibility. That's opened doors in terms of having conversations with people who might be willing to support the project in either in terms of their expertise or their access to capital. But those venues have been keen on highlighting the oddities and not necessarily engaging the deeper attempt at social engineering through better design. And if I may call it that, it's probably a little bit of a kind of hyperbole to call it that, but grant me that license at least today, because I'm so excited to be here. There's my hope is that a venue like or an outlet like Dwell or something would be willing to kind of take it on in terms of like couching it in a more accessible fashion, so that the more sophisticated offering of this dialogue you're talking about a little bit might become a subtext. Because it would be a very sophisticated audience indeed to understand that a building that doesn't meet all of your kind of rote desires in a prescriptive way is probably going to be the most interesting way in which to approach your need for housing. And
because I think what's amazing about your work is not just it's like technical amazingness, but you sort of operating at a level that sort of understands that there's a kind of a fashion sensibility in it, that it actually has to appeal at levels that aren't immediately like a matter of square feet or whatever. Like these things are very beautiful and they're very cool and they're very of their time. And I think you know that, and I think it might succeed on that basis as much as any argument about acreage, cost or whatever. It's like people are just going to want to have one of these or two of these or 10 of them.
Interesting that you mentioned like the thing that made this.
I appreciate the vote of confidence there.
The thing that actually separated that from every other development since then or before then was the advertisement, and that they never showed an image of the house. They would show something like a vase of flowers and a line that would say, "Discover the beauty of nature, live in my house." That it was very much a kind of desire-based thing. But I like how this is evolving into a conversation. I think it would be better to have it at the opening of John's exhibition. So maybe with that, let's welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming in. Appreciate it. Thank you.